The reality is right now with COVID-19, we're sitting here in this pandemic that has kind of shaken some things up. It's shaken up our rhythms. It's shaken up some of what we're used to doing week after week, and that includes attending a church service. So I want to say this. I believe that this is a defining time, and I believe it can be a fruitful time for the church. And I believe that in this time, we could actually be challenged in what it means to meet as a church and be the church in a faithful way to Jesus and to Scripture. So let me ask you, when you think about the word church, what do you think about? What do you think about? What do you think the word church means? Well, in Scripture, when the word church is used, it comes from a Greek word that means that is ekklesia, which means the called out ones. And so if we're followers of Jesus, if I'm a follower of Jesus or you're a follower of Jesus, we are the church. I'm the church. You are the church. So what does this mean for us gathering together then? I've heard some concern, both from people I know, people here at the church, people online, that maybe in this season, churches could fall into breaking or going against the command that Hebrews 10 gives us. And Hebrews 10:25 says this, "Let us not neglect our meeting together." The reality is that is a legitimate fear. It's a legitimate fear. But the reality is that particular verse was written in a different time where actually church gatherings, congregations gathered in a way different way than we do here in 2020 in America. So it is possible to be faithful to this command, but it look differently. I've said this before and I'll continue saying it. I believe that two of the voices that the modern church in America needs to hear are the voices of the past, the early church, and particularly the first couple hundred years of Christianity, and the voices of the persecuted church now, the global church, but in particularly the persecuted church. So I'm going to take just the next couple minutes and we're going to look at these voices. The first voice, the persecuted church, and globally, you know that there are people, there are Christians right now in other places in the world where it is illegal for them to meet for Christian worship. And so they can't meet in a building that a church organization can own like we can here. So they're meeting in secret, in homes, and in the back rooms of some businesses. And they're gathering together and maybe they're whispering the songs so they're not heard. Maybe they're not singing at all. Maybe there's only one Bible for these gatherings that they all share. Maybe they don't have a Bible at all. Maybe they're like a watch party, and I've seen this before. They're gathering together around a computer screen to watch a sermon and maybe watch some music as well. That is how they are gathering faithfully. And I want to ask you this question. If one of the leaders of one of those churches, gatherings in a persecuted part of America, if they were to come and meet with us right now to speak to us and give us encouragement, what do you think they would say? I could tell you for me, I would probably be pretty convicted because of what they might say from their context based on how I understand church and gathering and life based on my context. And I actually believe that they would encourage us to look at our context now and our situation now, and they would say, how can you creatively be faithful to still gather in this time in different ways? The other voice that I believe that we need to hear is the early church. And what I mean by that is Jesus was crucified somewhere around 33 AD. And so what I mean are his followers after that moment that continued on the movement of Christianity and the way of Jesus after him. Well, we look back at those followers and how they gathered, and they actually gathered in churches, in house churches and networks of home churches. Actually, one that we could look at, actually in Galilee, from one of the, or two of the original 12 disciples of Jesus is the house of Peter and Andrew. The house of Peter and Andrew, after Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended back to heaven, they met together, and they could probably fit maybe 15 people in their house, but they met together and gathered in their house, and now their house is known as the Church of the Apostles. We look at Rome. Rome actually was very similar to New York in the way that there's these rows of these apartment complexes. And these apartment complexes are normally about 3 stories high. And there'd be these network of church gatherings in these apartment complexes that could maybe seat 5, maybe 15 people. Now, like New York, some of these apartment gatherings, the lower level was used for business space. And so it's possible that there was maybe a business owner that rented out an area on the bottom level and lived in an apartment in the top level. And so they might give their business space up for a gathering where maybe they could seat anywhere between 20 to 30 people in that space, but they had to be secret about it oftentimes as well. And so when Paul writes to the church in Rome or the church in Corinth, he's writing to a network of these house gatherings. And so when we look at Romans 16 in particular, we actually see names listed out like Phoebe, and these are people that were leaders of these different house churches, these house gatherings in this network. We see this in the church of Corinth, and in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we see 4 different people, including Chloe, listed. These were owners of houses that were part of these house gathering networks. Now later on, maybe the 3rd century or so, we see that there's rich people that own maybe multiple houses, and they would give up their large houses now to be retrofitted for places of worship. So their swimming pools would become baptismals, their large hangout living areas would become worship assemblies and sanctuaries, their giant eating areas would become fellowship halls. And that happened in the 3rd century, and about 100 years later, Christianity became legal in 313 AD. And it was at that moment that those houses became the first basilicas. And it was from that moment, 280 years of Christianity meeting in little home gatherings, then they started to meet in bigger gatherings and bigger rooms that led into Gothic architecture and led into even some of the church buildings that we have today. But it took 280 years of meeting in houses to get to that point, and they met faithfully. They gathered faithfully. I want to go back to Jesus, and I want to go back to this idea of the ecclesia being the called out ones. We see in Mark 1, Jesus called out his first 12. He says this in Mark 1, verse 17, "Follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." You see, the call to be called out is to be called out for something. And in this, it's to be called out for mission. And so the mission of the church is not for us to gather for the sake of gathering. It's when we gather to be formed for the sake of mission. And we say here that the mission of the church is the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. Go and make disciples and love your neighbor as yourself. And this is what the early church understood. We see that there were 2 moments of sicknesses, 2 major pandemics, one in 251 AD and one in 260 AD. And the church was known by how they took care of the people who were sick and dying. As a matter of fact, many people fled the cities, and it was the Christians that saw their mission to stay behind and take care of the sick and dying. And Christianity went from 1 Christian every 249 pagans to 1 Christian every 4 pagans because they lived into their mission. But we believe that church is not a building. Church is the called out ones by Jesus for mission. And just like the 3rd century, this moment of this pandemic might actually be a catalyst that God uses for revival. It might be a catalyst that God uses for the church to respond and to be the salt and light into the world in a way that we didn't expect and we might miss. This is a moment for us to steward.